In this video, I want to talk about flight. I want to caution you against something. Of course, it's your game, your table. Do whatever it is that brings the most excitement and joy to you and your players. But do not allow low-level PCs, especially level 1. Do not allow flight. So, obviously, don't give them magic items that allow them to fly. Yes, there are many races where flight comes on board later, and that's fine. It should be a reward, something that they can look forward to. Dragonborn, I think it is, and Aasimar, they might get wings and things like this at much higher level, maybe even level 14. That's fine. They might acquire magic items that allow them to fly. That's fine. Now, when I say don't allow low-level PCs to fly, I'm not talking about like an Eberron where they get on a flying ship in order to move across the world. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about personal flight. And how does that happen? How does that come about at level 1 where I would caution you against it? The spark for this was I was browsing through the most recently released book, Strixhaven, I think it is, and the new race in there is the Owlin. And I think, if my memory serves, the Owlin are able to fly with a speed equal to their walking speed. Do not allow this at level 1. Here's why. Let me back up a little bit, give you a little context, a little bit of a story. When I was going to art school 20 years ago, my instructor's brother-in-law was one of WoW's lead designers, I think artists, right? And if you remember original World of Warcraft, I'm not talking about WoW Classic where they brought it back. We're talking 2004, I think it is. I don't think there was flying. Hell, mounts, just being able to move faster on a mount was hard to come by. But flying was not a thing. It wasn't until maybe Burning Crusade, the first expansion, something like this, where flight became a thing. And I remember in class, my instructor was talking to his brother-in-law during that time. And his brother-in-law was talking about how they had so many art assets that they had to sort of redo, right? Because when they built 3D models, when they built the world, they could sort of, and this happens a lot in video games, maybe not so much now. I don't have my finger on the pulse of the video game design artistic world like I used to, so I don't know the limitations anymore, but it would kind of be like a Hollywood facade, right? Video games would only create visually the actual 3D models and render out the stuff that you as a player can interact with and see. Right? Just like in a Hollywood, or, you go through Universal Studios and you notice that, the front of the building, the clock tower, the bell tower in Back to the Future, behind it is nothing but scaffolding and wood. There's no actual structure and building behind that. You just need to see the front of it. And I remember my instructor was talking to his brother-in-law and they were talking about how once flight was introduced, they now had to render the roofs, the rooftops. They had to render what it looked like on the other side or inside of the building, because now you're above it. See, what flying does in a world where it's not automatic, right? And it is not automatic in D&D. Yes, flying ships, of course, they exist. Flying creatures exist in Eberron. There are magic items that allow you to fly. But the assumption is from level 1, the world still feels so large to you. The verticality of the world is in place. You cannot see things up above. You cannot yet get to the cloud giant cities or the dragon layered peaks. To get to the dragon layered peaks, you need climbing gear. You need Arctic or cold weather gear. You need a ring of warmth. You need a guide. You need, what would be the equivalent of Sherpa climbing in Everest. You need help to get up there. You can't just click a button, so to speak, and pull out your wings or click on your ring and fly up there. And when you give that to races, and yes, I might be speaking to WotC designers, when you give that out of the gate, when you allow the Owlin race, I don't know if it's Aarakocra that might also have it. When you allow that, you are changing the sense of scale in the world tremendously. You now need to create content. Now, you might be saying, well, Rich, what's wrong with that? As the DM, then I just need to create verticality. I need to create things that happen at 50 feet because my PCs are typically going to be up at 50 feet in height. See, but no different as a child, right? A small folk. that's crawling and standing up and walking at ground level, right? Being grounded. Remembering where they came from, right? I mean that's in a certain sense, that's the metaphor or the analogy that we oftentimes use is no matter how flighty, high and mighty you get, learn to kind of eat some humble pie. Learn to ground yourself a little. Remember where you came from. And when you're at eye level with the guards, when you're looking up at giants, when you are looking up at the peaks, like remember when you first took a look at Skyrim and you see the mountains out there. When you look up at the dragons that are flying above you, when you look up at the cathedrals of the Pantheon, there's a certain sense of awe and wonder. Imagine the scale and scope of the Colosseum if you were flying and looking down to it. But it changes when you look at the perspective when Maximus first kind of looked up in Gladiator. It reminds you that you're still small, that there's bigger, better. There's more out there. There's some stuff that you can't quite reach. And you only maintain that scale if you don't allow flight out of the gate. Remember, this is a reward that you can give later. Open up the world later. And sort of on that note, I would caution against allowing too much worldly travel, druid gates and teleportation, an NPC or dragon that befriends the party at level 2 and offers to take them everywhere. Because some of the grit and the crunch, regardless of how high fantasy, how fancy your world or your story is, the grit and the grime and the crunch of early level D&D is you've got to get to that nearby city, that town 25 miles away. That's a full day's journey. That means somewhere along that road, without pushing into constitution and exhaustion, you're probably going to have to long rest. And there's value in that. There's gameplay in that, just as there is in not being able to fly. Because perhaps even more importantly than messing with the scale of the world, when you allow flight at early levels, you mitigate so many of the obstacles that should be in the way of your group, in the way of your PCs. You see, when there's a story of a dwarven fortress and an impenetrable wall of steel, reinforced by steel, and it's 30 feet high, it loses so much of its luster, so much of its value, its shine, and its impact when your character can fly for 3 rounds and fly over it. Yes, I know you can account for that and have javelineers and whatever you want to call them, range combatants on the wall and dwarven hammer throwers and lightning rods that shoot way up into the sky to take down aerial threats and whatnot. But when your PCs kind of walk up to the wall in the front door and the guards say, "We're not letting you in," and they seal that iron door, there's some heft there. There's impact there when your PC's kind of, well, what do we do now? How to help? We're not going to break through that. We're not going to beat on this with a hammer. How do we get over that wall? But then you do lead into the rogue deciding to try and climb it at night. To create a distraction off in the woods and allow me to climb over the wall. Make some climb checks. Make some athletic checks. What's the texture of the wall? Is it slippery? Did the city watch account for people trying to climb that wall? There's a large chasm that separates one nation from the next. And it's that chasm which is a natural border. And it's filled with spikes and pits and beetles the size of rhinoceros and, whatever it might be. But when you can fly over that chasm, you just lost all that content. Really think through how much your players can bypass by simply flying over it. Again, this is something that they should have an option. I'm not saying you need to remove the fly spell from the player's handbook. I'm not saying you need to make it a level 6 spell. I'm not saying you need to remove it from the list of a wizard and what. No, it doesn't need to be nerfed. Leave it where it is. But at level 1, level 2, don't allow flight. Don't allow the Owlin race. Don't allow those races that out of the gate, without any drawbacks. Sure, if you want to create some homebrew thing and You can fly temporarily for 5 feet around for 1 minute per long rest. And when you do so, you pull against some winged demon that causes 2d6 psychic damage. Okay. Make it some sort of patron boon or warlock thingy or whatever, right? If your player's really clamoring for that. But to allow Superman at level 1, so much of the world is bypassed. So much of your content, so many obstacles. You remove the need for your players to just simply have to figure shit out with something like flight. Because flight becomes one of those buttons that you push that lets you say to the DM, hey, there's something on my sheet. Let's disregard that. I just go over it. I just go through it. I just spend the next 2 hours flying high enough. Yes, I know that you can throw threats of Dracolich and dragons up in the sky, but I just want to fly at like 150 and just fly over the Orcish Badlands. You've just removed all of that post-apocalyptic crunch and nuance of, well, this orc tribe is at war with this orc tribe and they're KOS. They'll kill on sight anyone that's an outsider. And how are you going to weave your way through these different encampments? You removed all of that subterfuge and that interest and that stealth. Because if your PCs are on a scouting mission, your Owlin just says, I'll fly over it and I'll find out what I need to find out on the other side and make sure that we're flying above the threats. You know, to me, flight is no different than giving someone right out of the gate all of the abilities to breathe. You know, I know there's amphibious and things like that, and there's a turtle, but be careful with that as well. Because even though you're playing in a magical realm and a magical world and there's fantasy, you still need to ground it early level. Let that fantasy come on board when they have the ability to cast flight, when they have the ability to cast water breathing. And even though it's a fantastical race, a water Ganassi, an air Ganassi, I get it. But house rule it and change things so that things don't come on board. They'll come on board certainly much earlier than other races, but maybe it doesn't come on board early on. Because even though it's fantastical and it's imaginary make-believe, still hold on to the value of, in a certain sense, real life. We are not made to be underwater. That is a foreign environment, and as such, it inherently has its own dangers with it. We are not made to move through the skies without the aid of technology. But it has its own inherent dangers. That's what separates us from a peregrine falcon, and what separates us from a marlin. Right? But notice how in your world it puts more value on an apparatus of Qualish because now you have submarines and you can go below the depths and investigate things. Now it puts more value on befriending that dragon at level 7 so that he can take you up to the dragon-layered peaks and fly you across continents. It puts more value on druid gates. It puts more value on teleportation. It puts more value on the abilities that Dragonborn or Aasimars get later on, and the fly spell, and the fact that it's a concentration. So tread lightly with flight. This is my cautionary tale. Do not do it. Do not allow flight early on in your games. I'll see you guys soon.